In 2012, Connecticut law enforcement found a trash bag in the woods. It contained a young pit bull who'd been brutally beaten and strangled to death.
Animal cruelty cases are hard to stomach and comprehend, but more often than not, the offender is given a slap on the wrist.
The case of Desmond is tragic. He had originally been owned by a woman who was in an unhealthy relationship, and she had given Desmond up because she was trying to get herself out of that scenario. The guy that she had been in that relationship went to the shelter, and so he adopted Desmond. And then he spends the next few months litigating custody for the daughter he had with Desmond's former owner in court, and at night he'd come back to his house where he had Desmond locked up in his bathroom and abused Desmond. And then one day, he ultimately strangled Desmond to death. It's a clear-cut example of animal abuse.
The owner avoiding jail time. The crime was expunged from his record after rehabilitation.
The way it gets resolved is the defendant is offered the opportunity to enter into a diversion program.
Diversion programs are intended to provide rehabilitation focused on preventing future offenses. Upon completion, the defendant's record is then wiped clean. In Connecticut, diversion programs are not supposed to be available to perpetrators of violent crimes. However, because animals are often categorized as property, crimes against them tend to be viewed through that lens.
There just wasn't anyone in the courtroom whose job it was to point out to the judge, to the prosecutor, to the defense attorney that perhaps, even though dogs are property, this was not a property crime. That perhaps strangling a dog to death is, in fact, a crime of violence. And so a group of citizens got together, dubbed themselves Desmond's Army, and started figuring out what they could do about this.
They developed a really coordinated effort to pass legislation that would help ensure that this injustice doesn't occur to more animal victims.
So I'm going to talk to you about a new law that we have in Connecticut called Desmond's Law.
And this is the first CAAP law on the books anywhere in the country.
The law allows an advocate to present the interests of an animal victim and also the interests of justice to a court in an animal cruelty case.
Working neither for the prosecution or the defense, advocates are either volunteer lawyers or supervised law students appointed by the court. Throughout each case, advocates offer assistance in various ways, including drafting briefs, conducting research, providing important context on animal law, gathering information from veterinarians and law enforcement officials, and making recommendations to the court on behalf of the animal's welfare.
You've got a victim that can't testify. You've got a need for very complex, very scientific forensic analysis. And you've got some really unique laws that aren't always intuitive and aren't the kind of things that your average prosecutor, defense attorney, or judge is going to be familiar with.
They're also dealing with living, breathing evidence that's separate from inanimate objects. And so the animals have to be cared for during this time while the case is prosecuted, which can be months, it can be over a year sometimes. So an advocate is someone who can keep their eyes on this animal throughout the process, make recommendations throughout, and ensure that the animal is receiving the best care.
In some cases, advocates are tasked with making sentencing recommendations for the defendant that, depending on the specifics of the case, can range from jail time and restitution to counseling or training.
Our approach is not always to pursue incarceration at the highest level. We really take a nuanced look and examine the case and reach our own recommendation. Sometimes our recommendation favors leaving an animal with the defendant and supplementing with services that might help the defendant and or the animal continue to live together.
So we're looking at things like mental health treatment. We're looking at things like education, things that really prevent future animal suffering.
Possession bans are vitally important, especially in egregious cases of animal cruelty, because we want to ensure that someone who has committed such a violent crime against animals can't get their hands on another animal.
Advocates can speak to what is necessary to prevent other animals from suffering, looking at this not just as a matter of advocating for an individual animal, but advocating for all animals going forward.
We know that animal cruelty is an act of violence. We also know that it's a big red flag for future violent behavior.
There are clearly established links between humans harming animals and humans harming other humans.
So if we can intercept these crimes early, provide some sort of education and therapy to these young offenders, we can hopefully divert the type of action in the future.
Several states have already passed their own CAAP laws, while other states are considering similar legislation.
The Animal Legal Defense Fund is working with lawmakers and building coalitions in numerous states to advance this type of legislation. We're also working with our student chapters in these states where legislation is pending to build interest, to gain their support.
Talk with your lawmakers, which again is what Desmond's Army did. Show up and ask why something's happening. Show up and say, I understand this is the way the law works, and I'm here to support the animals. And at the end of the day, that's what they did, and that's how you get things done on behalf of animals.
To learn more, visit aldf.org/CAAP.